President Trump has won the battleground state of Florida.
The state of Minnesota has been projected to go in the Biden column.
This is a fraud. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election.
Projecting the winner of Michigan, Biden.
Wisconsin to flip for Joe Biden.
I'm confident we'll emerge victorious.
If Biden holds his lead in Arizona, holds his lead in Nevada, that would equal exactly 270 electoral votes for him.
Good morning. I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Welcome to Washington Post Live's First Look. So much has happened even within the few minutes before we came on to air. So let's go right to Dan Balz, Washington Post chief national correspondent and federal political reporter and editor. Dan, within the last, 3 minutes, a new bunch of votes came in Pennsylvania, putting Joe Biden in the lead in Pennsylvania. What does it mean?
Well, it means he's going to be president of the United States unless something dramatically reverses that, which nobody expects at this point. I mean, he is now about 5,600 votes ahead of President Trump in Pennsylvania. Those 20 electoral votes are critical. There's no way that Donald Trump can get to 270 without Pennsylvania, given everything else on the map. So, this is a dramatic shift. It has been coming for 2 days. People have been predicting it. The Biden campaign has been quite confident about it. The Trump campaign has insisted through several days of counting that they would ultimately prevail, that their lead would hold up, but it hasn't. It's gone. But in addition to that, overnight, Biden took the lead in Georgia by roughly about 1,100 votes. That race is destined to be very, very close to the end. It may go into a recount, but if Biden were to hold that as well as Pennsylvania, maintain his current lead in Arizona, which is in the neighborhood of 47,000 votes, but has been trickling down, and holds his lead in Nevada, he would end up with more than 300 electoral votes.
Dan, I'm glad you brought up Georgia because that was going to be my next question, and you answered it, and you brought up Arizona and Nevada. So let's talk about this. What happens if the president retakes the lead in Arizona, and the call that the AP and Fox News have made, but no other news organizations have made, and those electoral votes go to President Trump? Basically, what I'm asking is, can Joe Biden still win the presidency by taking Pennsylvania, but losing Arizona, Georgia, and Nevada?
Yes, I believe so, although I'd have to do the recalculation on if he loses Nevada. But certainly, if he wins, if Trump were to win Arizona and Georgia, but Biden holds Nevada, then it's game over. All he needed was to retake those three northern states, all other things being equal, and it appears that he's been able to do that.
Mm-hmm. By the he, you're talking.
By he, I mean by Biden.
Right. Okay. Just wanted to double check.
Jonathan, that's why Pennsylvania became such a battleground in the final week. The president knew he absolutely needed that because there were concerns in his camp about Michigan and Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania was always a better state for him in the estimation of the campaign. But Biden and his team had targeted that state literally from the very beginning of his candidacy as the state that was likely to be the tipping point state, and it's turning out to be that case.
And what we're learning is that the strategy of getting people to vote by mail is inuring to Biden's benefit, because the votes that we're now seeing coming in Pennsylvania are mail-in ballots, and they appear to be the majority of them going for former Vice President Biden. Let's talk about what happened last night.
Dan, one more thing about that.
Sure, go right ahead. Yeah.
The other reality about that is most of these votes in Pennsylvania that are coming in are from blue areas, Philadelphia city, and then the Philadelphia suburbs, which have, as we know, trended toward Democrats for a number of years. and strongly so during President Trump's presidency.
Right. So last night, you and I were taking part in a post-election analysis of an election that's still ongoing at the JFK Library, virtually, of course, when the President of the United States took to the White House briefing room and gave probably one of the most extraordinary press conferences of his presidency, spinning lots of falsehoods, misinformation, and outright lies, so much so that MSNBC, CNN, and all the broadcast networks turned away from the President of the United States. Could you talk about the reaction to what the president said in the political world?
Well, the reaction has been, I won't say universal, because the Trump family has been stoking efforts to get Republicans to back up the president. But in general, the political world did turn its back on President Trump, not just the media, not just the mainstream media. Other Republicans were calling him out for it. So it was, I mean, you and I did not watch it live because we were doing the virtual panel, but it was a repeat in some ways on steroids of what he had done in the middle of the night during election night. There's similar charges, but baseless charges and without any evidence. And you know, Chris Christie, who has been a loyal ally of the president, but at times willing to call the president out, has basically said at some point the president's going to have to put up or stop talking. Either they have real evidence of fraud or stolen elections or some nefarious activity, or they don't. And if they don't, simply saying it doesn't make it so. And I think that is what caused the reaction last night. I mean, it was not surprising on the part of the president to do that. It's totally within his character. It's what he did the election night, and probably will continue to do that. He cannot accept defeat. He cannot admit defeat. He cannot admit that something went wrong that he was responsible for. But he seems to have very little support within the Republican ranks in claiming that this was a stolen election.
Mm-hmm. I apologize for looking away while you were speaking, because I wanted to pull up the tweet that Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell sent out just before 8 a.m. He tweeted out, "Here's how this must work in our great country. Every legal vote should be counted. Any illegally submitted ballots must not. All sides must get to observe the process, and the courts are here to apply the laws and resolve disputes. That's how Americans' votes decide the result." Everything that Leader McConnell said in that tweet is what's happening. You've observed Leader McConnell as long as I have. Sift through the tea leaves here. What message is he sending, not only to the American people, but to the White House?
Well, he's basically telling the White House and telling the president to knock it off and to let this process play out and let the votes be counted. And if there are legitimate disputes, to have those adjudicated, and then the winner will be determined. But you know, Senator McConnell has been very careful in the way he has dealt with the president. He's been enormously supportive in many ways because he knows that the president is helpful to the agenda that he cares most about, which is kind of a traditional conservative legislative agenda, and most importantly, to change the judicial system, the courts in this country. And working with the president, he has been enormously successful on that front. But from the time Donald Trump was a candidate, he has often carefully kept his distance. He has not spoken out in a strong way against the president. You notice that statement is very carefully worded, and in some ways is worded the way that some people around the president would like the president to speak. But it is clearly a signal to the president that what he is doing rhetorically has no basis and that he ought to stop it.
That's the thing about Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. Say what you will about his political tactics. when he speaks and when he doesn't speak, both those things speak volumes. You need to pay attention to it. One more thing I need to ask you, Dan, before we go, and we're already out of time. But also before we came on air here, CNN was reporting their sources saying that the president, if he does indeed lose the election, that he won't concede. How important is it for President Trump to concede if indeed he does not win re-election?
Well, it matters not at all if he doesn't concede. I mean, the votes are the votes. The states will certify the election results, and the winner will be declared. And if it's not President Trump, it doesn't matter if he won't concede. That's A, the main point. But B, it will be further evidence of the legacy that he is going to carry out of the White House, which is somebody who has never been willing to act and operate in a way that a president is expected to act. I mean, we talked about this last night, Jonathan, on the panel about the incredibly gracious speech that Al Gore gave the night that he lost the presidency to George W. Bush. Yes, and it was an amazingly gracious speech at a time when he was in deep pain. It is hard to imagine this president ever doing such a thing.
Dan Balz, it's been great spending the mornings with you all week. Don't take it personally if I tell you, I hope I don't see you next week. Dan Balz, thank you very much for coming on First Look.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Let's go over to the opinion side of the Washington Post, where we will find my colleagues, Washington Post Deputy Editorial Page Editor Ruth Marcus and contributing columnist Gary Abernathy. Okay, I just want to start off by getting each of you to just give me your thoughts right now as we woke up this morning with former Vice President Joe Biden having taken the lead in Georgia, and then, as I said at the top of the show, that just before we came on air, new votes came in Pennsylvania, putting former Vice President Joe Biden in the lead in Pennsylvania. From your perspective, Gary, I'll start with you first. Are we looking at the end of this presidential race?
Well, first, Jonathan and Ruth, it's great to see both of you. Thank you very much for having me on today. It looks that way. It's looked that way for a day or so. That it was. I agree with Dan and everyone else. It's been trending that direction. It looks pretty good for Joe Biden. But as everybody says, let's count all the votes and see what happens. I hope that one thing that comes out of this election. I've really never understood for a long time why it's so important to call these states, for the media to make a call when a race is obviously going to be so tight. It's really just about bragging rights and, oh, we got it first, we got it right. In some states, it's obviously, let's go ahead and call California. Let's go ahead and call West Virginia. No need to wait. But in some of these states, there's nothing to be gained, and it just creates a lot of animosity and extra tension in an election where extra tension is the last thing we need.
Ruth?
Well, I think that Gary is right. By the end of the day, by probably lunchtime for all of us, or those of us on the East Coast, it's going to be clear to every rational person, by which I include everybody on this discussion, even you, John. And I'm going to see you. We're on Zoom time, so you're out of luck. Joe Biden is going to be the president-elect and the next president of the United States. And I think if we had all been put in a kind of medically induced coma from Tuesday afternoon through this morning, and we woke up to this result, it would look much more better for Democrats than the anxiety that the country has gone through and that some Democrats have bemoaned over the last few days. Joe Biden is not going to only win the popular vote by a remarkable margin, by more votes than Hillary Clinton, but he's going to win the Electoral College by probably about the same or a greater number than Donald Trump won in the key states that Donald Trump won by a total of about 70,000 votes. Joe Biden's margin is probably going to be larger than that. The only person who is not accepting this outcome, or people who are not accepting this outcome, are Donald Trump, his family, and his delusional enablers. And it is a blot on them to go along with what the president did last night, which was a direct assault on the integrity of the democratic system. There is no widespread evidence of fraud. There is no basis for contesting this result, just as there would have been no basis for Hillary Clinton to contest the result 4 years ago. This is why we have elections.
Ruth, let's keep talking about that because you anticipated my next question, which is to talk about what happened last night in the White House press briefing room. I mean, it's not unusual for the president of the United States to talk to the American people from the briefing room. But what the president did was so egregious that CNN and MSNBC broke away, and all the broadcast networks broke away within minutes. In the case of MSNBC, within seconds.
Well,
Ruth,
Gary,
sorry.
Complaining that television networks and cable operations are too quick to call races. I think that for the most part, that's been extremely responsible. The message has been we have to wait till all the votes are counted. The one person who wants to call the race and assert that he won before all the votes are counted is the person who was in the White House briefing room last night. It was the single most alarming and appalling performance by a president of the United States that I have ever seen. He claimed without any basis that votes were being stolen from him and that the election was about to be stolen from him by Democrats. That is wildly irresponsible. And you were talking to Dan about the implications of the president not conceding. And of course, it's true, as Dan said, that if the president doesn't concede, it doesn't have any technical effect. You don't have to have a gracious concession speech. We are not going to have graciousness from President Trump. But it has an impact on the 69 million people who voted for him, much to my dismay. And to do that, take that step and rile up these voters and lead them to believe that there's been massive fraud in this election, that it's rigged and that it's being stolen from them is massively irresponsible.
Okay, go ahead, Gary.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah, and I agree with most of what Ruth just said. I certainly don't like what Trump said. It should have been absolutely not surprising to anyone that he said it. Anyone who's followed President Trump for 4 years, that's pretty much, you could have predicted really well that that's what he was going to come out and say last night. I will say, I'll take a little different point of view about the networks pulling away from him. I think that was really, really a bad decision. This guy is still the duly elected president of the United States. He just went through an election where he came darn close to winning re-election. It's a razor-tight election, and Americans can handle what he has to say. And this is why I think the media has a real struggle with their own credibility and their own approval ratings and their own popularity ratings, which tend to be even lower than politicians, which is they take it upon themselves to say, well, we can't let you hear what the president's saying because he's just lying to you. Well, you know what? America can handle lies, and there'll be time to come back and correct that. There'll be time to do fact checking, but to just interrupt him and come back and say, well, we can't let you listen to the president of the United States anymore, I think is a big mistake, Jonathan.
But 1 second, Ruth. But Gary, if the president of the United States is continually out there saying 2 + 2 = 5, and we all know that that's not only not true, but a lie, isn't it responsible for the media to cut away? I mean, it's not like the media cut away and the president was saying something new. The media cut away because the media was hearing coming from the president of the United States information that had already been debunked, shown to be not true or outright lies, and had been fact-checked to within an inch of its life.
No, I think that if you're talking about any other time, maybe, but we're in the week of the election, and again, Jonathan, I just think he's the president of the United States. Mm-hmm. If you think he's lying, and I agree, 90% of what he was saying last night was not true, will be shown not to be true, but he'll go to court and prove that. And by the way, let me add also, it's not time yet to concede. Now, will he ever concede? I think that's 50-50 at best. Probably not. But but it's also not time yet. This is a very tight election.
Right.
It's okay to go through the process, file some court filings, wait to see what comes back from that before we talk about conceding this election. Al Gore didn't concede for 35 days. Let's be clear about that.
Mm-hmm. All right, Ruth, have at it.
Well, I was so anxious to get in because I'm going to surprise both of you by agreeing with Gary here. I really do believe
Thank you.
that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And I stuck with, I think it was CNN that was simultaneously broadcasting the president's remarks and had a chyron that proclaimed their falseness.
They've been very good about that.
I have always thought that people should be able to hear from the president and judge for themselves. And the minute he finished speaking, Jake Tapper got on and denounced it as appalling. I think that was the better approach, but I do think with lies like this, networks are in a tough position. So just enjoy that moment of agreement with you, Gary.
I will.
This is great. Okay, so Ruth, I need you to talk about the legal efforts that are being mounted by the Trump campaign in various places around the country. Do his legal challenges have any merit? And are those legal challenges really about winning in court, or are they about really about a messaging campaign with the ultimate goal of trying to delegitimize a potential Biden presidency?
Bingo. It's sound and fury. The spate of lawsuits that they've mounted are not apt to succeed. There's a lot of complaining about very little. And if we were talking about a small segment of votes in one key state, we talked the other day about these late arriving ballots in Pennsylvania. You could imagine a legitimate legal argument about that. But this is just trying to throw around a lot of dirt to convince people, not simply to delegitimize the Biden presidency, but to rile up people, to potentially get them to take to the streets to protest that this election is being stolen from President Trump. It is not being stolen from President Trump. And which leads me to the thing that I'm keeping an eye on that I am most alarmed about, which is not that his court challenges will succeed, because they won't, but we started to hear yesterday suggestions from Mark Levin, the conservative radio host, retweeted by the president's son, Donald Trump Jr., then amplified a little bit on Sean Hannity last night by Senator Lindsey Graham, the notion that state legislatures who've decided that the popular vote in their state is somehow rigged and not correct could submit competing sets of electors to Congress to decide in January when it certifies the results of the election. This is a recipe for constitutional chaos. It's like the nuclear option of the Electoral College. It could set up, if Republican senators were to go along with this, a situation where Biden and Trump would have competing claims to the presidency, and no one really knows how it would be finally adjudicated. But it is a disaster in waiting, and responsible Republican senators, by which I do not include Senator Lindsey Graham right now, should just shut it down, because it would be terrible for the country.
Speaking of responsible Republican senators, let me I'll start with you, Gary, and have you do what I asked Dan did, have you both do, but you start, Gary, do what Dan did and have you sift through the tea leaves of this tweet from Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell that was sent just before 8 a.m. He tweeted, "Here's how this must work in our great country. Every legal vote should be counted. Any illegally submitted ballots must not. All sides must get to observe the process, and the courts are here to apply the laws and resolve disputes. That's how Americans' votes decide the result." What message do you think, Gary, is Leader McConnell sending, not just to the American people, but to the president?
Well, I think it was, as you mentioned, as Dan mentioned, it was a very carefully worded statement. And the key word there is legal. And you heard President Trump emphasize this word last night when he was speaking. All legal votes should count. So I think that, frankly, is setting up the idea that whatever count we come up with, there may be a challenge to votes, whether they're legal or not. Were they postmarked in time? Were they received in time? All the states have different rules on on this issue. So I think, to me, he was being very careful to sound very pro-democracy. Let's count the votes, but he also stressed that word legal vote. So I think, and again, most court challenges are probably going to be thrown right back at Trump. There doesn't seem to be a lot to hang your hat on. I am concerned and reading stories, not in the right-wing media, but in the Post and the New York Times and so on. There did seem to be an issue in Philadelphia with observers being allowed to be close enough, and to me that doesn't necessarily suggest anything's wrong with that counting. But let's err on the side of openness and let people be close, let them see clearly what's going on, so we take that argument off the table. But Jonathan, I think McConnell's statement was, let's count all legal votes, which sounded to me an awful lot like what Trump was saying last night too.
Ruth?
I thought that Senator McConnell was typically canny and careful, and you could look at what he said as completely in line with what President Trump was saying, or you could look at what he said as a signal, as I think Dan took it and as I would take it, that he is not hopping on the "they are stealing the votes from me" bandwagon. He did not say, repeat, or even suggest any of the incendiary things that President Trump said in his press conference, or not press conference, press statement last night. And the tweet that I thought, or the comment that I thought was most significant this morning, came from Pennsylvania Republican Senator Pat Toomey, who said flat out, no evidence of widespread fraud in the voting in Pennsylvania. Whether in the midst of a pandemic, whether you're 6 feet away or 10 feet away, we should provide for as much transparency and observation. But there is.
I don't know if this is happening on my end or what, but Ruth, I think you've conked out.
Yeah, I think she cut out a little bit.
Can you guys hear me now?
Now I can hear you. Go ahead, Ruth.
I think that was the Trump administration trying to just shut me down, like the network shut him down. I was just saying that Senator Toomey said there's no evidence of widespread fraud, and without that, Donald Trump is just playing a losing hand with his typical lack of graciousness.
Gary, I was just about to ask about the relative silence from Republicans on what the president said. You have now Pat Toomey out this morning, Senator Toomey this morning. Congressman Adam Kinzinger was the lone person out there yesterday saying that what the president was doing was harmful to the republic.
Yeah.
Why are Republicans so mute on something so important?
Well, this election showed them that this is still a Trump Republican Party. And I think about people like my old boss, Rob Portman, who I know, is a totally different personality than a Donald Trump. And yet he represents a state of Ohio that once again went 8 points for Trump. Even if Trump's not president, he still has to be concerned with that base. And so they're not going to come out and contradict him right now. I think that they all agree. I think the 90% of Republicans agree there's no real reason to be concerned about the vote right now. But my goodness, they're not going to be too vociferous about Trump. It was funny to me. Trump's presence on the ticket on Tuesday obviously helped most Republicans. It certainly didn't hurt most of them. It helped them. And I was thinking people like Lindsey Graham and maybe even particularly Rob Portman, who wasn't on the ticket, but who must be saying, gee, he helped carry us over the finish line. Maybe we get the benefit of him being on the ticket, but the benefit of him not actually being in the White House after that too. So we'll see how this plays out when all the votes are counted.
The last question, because we got less than 2 minutes left, to each of you, starting with you, Gary, does quote unquote Trumpism survive in Washington without President Trump in the White House?
Depends on how these Senate races come out, to what degree. I think yes. Overall, Trumpism survives. It was a strong, it was not a repudiation of Trumpism, let's put it that way, Jonathan. So it survives. But you have if Joe Biden's the president, as a former senator, he's got good relations with people like Mitch McConnell. We'll see how that goes. We may actually have a bit of a return to some deal making, but the 2024 race starts right away. There will be Trumpist candidates who will grab the base of the party, and that's always going to pull Republicans towards the Trumpism as long as he seems to dominate the base, the general primary voters, let's say, of the GOP.
Ruth?
59 million votes means Trumpism survives. Trump is not gently or going away, though I think a lot of his Republican colleagues in the Senate might prefer that and might prefer not having to always be looking at their Twitter alerts to see what he has to say that they need to respond to. Gary is more bullish than I am about the prospect for deal making in the Senate. Even before Donald Trump, this was Senator Mitch McConnell, whose goal was to make certain that President Obama would be a one-term president, and that is his goal for certain about President-elect Biden. First time I've said that, soon to be President-elect Biden and President Harris. So it is going to be, I think, a very ugly stretch here in Washington.
Yeah, I think it's going to be totally lit all the way live, whatever analogy you want to use, if indeed Joe Biden does become president-elect and then president of the United States, dealing with a Republican-controlled Senate as well as a democratically controlled House. We are out of time, probably over time. So Gary and Ruth, thank you very much for coming on First Look.
Thank you both. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.
Sure thing. Thanks. And as always, thank you for tuning in. Washington Post Live will be back at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for an Election Daily with Bob Costa. Today, he is continuing election coverage, this time by talking with former Democratic presidential candidate Andrew Yang, chairman of the American Conservative Union, Matt Schlapp, and mayor of Atlanta, Keisha Lance Bottoms. Once again, I'm Jonathan Capehart, opinion writer for the Washington Post. Thank you for tuning in to Washington Post Live's First Look.